this on? Well, welcome everyone to our third in this season of Church Family Chats. Welcome to you who are in the seats tonight, and it's nice to see people coming out again. But also welcome to you that are viewing in by live stream. This speaker series is a collaboration between the three West End Christian Reformed churches: Inglewood Christian Reformed Church, where we're sitting tonight, West End Christian Reformed Church, and Covenant Community Christian Reformed Church. We begin by acknowledging that we're meeting this evening on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Blackfoot, the Métis, and Nakota Sioux people. And we're reminded that we're all treaty people. As we gather together this evening as a community of faith, could I open our meeting with a word of prayer? Dear God, we gather in your name as seekers of knowledge and insight into the ways that certain momentous events of the past have shaped our way of thinking in matters of faith and our relationship with you and your world. Thank you for the continuing testimony of the reformers, and particularly at this time of year, the witness of the great reformer, Martin Luther. Thank you for the work of Pastor Andrew in preparing our talk this evening, and we ask for a blessing for him on his presentation. Amen. This evening we're focusing on the Reformation and its impact on the world, our lives, and the church and the broader culture over time. We do so at this time of year because October 31st, in a week or so, will be the 445th anniversary of that fateful day in Wittenberg, Germany, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church. We'll be led this evening in our reflection on the Reformation by Reverend Andrew Aukema, and it gives me pleasure in introducing Pastor Andrew to you, as he is my pastor, as the pastor of this Inglewood Christian Reformed Church. Pastor Andrew grew up in southwestern Ontario, where he was raised in the Christian Reformed Church and attended the Christian day schools in his hometown of Chatham, Ontario. He attended the University of Windsor, where he received his Bachelor of Arts degree. He then found a calling to the ministry of the Word, and in pursuit of that, he attended Regent College at the University of British Columbia, where he received a Master of Divinity degree. Andrew became ordained in the Christian Reformed Church in March of 2013 after a course of ministerial candidate training at Calvin Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His ordination occurred in his first charge as pastor of the Prince George Christian Reformed Church. And after 9 years of service there, he responded to a call from this church, Inglewood Christian Reformed Church, and has served us since August 2021. Pastor Andrew is married to Miriam and has 3 young children, Elise, James, and Claire. So please join me in welcoming Pastor Andrew to our evening.
All right, we're on. It was good to the review of the different pattern of schools that I've been to, because actually preparing for this, I was going back to some notes from my days at Regent College. I come to this talk for the same reasons that you have come, which is to learn and out of curiosity. I'm not a historian per se, but the idea of this talk came up when I met with Jim in the spring, and we talked about some of the ideas that were going around for these family chats. And I mentioned a few ideas, and one that kind of resembled what we're doing tonight. And when he asked me if I'd take it on, I just thought it'd be a good challenge, an opportunity to go back through some of the things I've learned, some of the things I've read, do some new reading, and refresh my own understanding about the Reformation, and think critically on a few things too. To that end, just so you know, or if you're interested, a couple of the main resources that I went back to for just reviewing some of the history are Justo Gonzalez's book, The Story of Christianity, which is kind of a pretty main resource for church history courses in universities and seminaries. And then James Peyton wrote a book called Getting the Reformation Wrong. Wrote that about 10 or 12 years ago. So those are good things to go through. So my hope tonight is really to do one part history, one part kind of examination and reflection. For the reflection part, we'll look at some of the gains and losses of the Reformation. And I chose that language over pros and cons. I thought gains and losses is maybe a better way of looking at it. And then I want to kind of finish with a few thoughts of some lessons we can learn for today and for the future. When it comes to the history section, my idea was not so much to talk about Martin Luther and some of his upbringing and the things that were important to him and what happened in 1517 and the years after that. But I thought it'd be really interesting to look underneath the surface of the kind of the conditions or the way that we got to the point of 1517. Because if you believe the Reformation to be a seismic event, a world-changing event like an earthquake, which I think we should, earthquakes happen beneath the surface with these tectonic plates shifting and all these tensions pulling and pushing against each other. And so we're going to look at what's happening beneath the surface more than just the actual crack or events and the aftershocks. That's where we're going to begin. So you can go to the first slide, Theo. It's easy to think that, and have a general belief that the Reformation happened because Martin Luther just kind of woke up, was having a very bad day. There's a lot of things that have been bugging him, and he wrote a thread of 95 tweets, or just a big blog post that went viral. Which actually isn't a bad explanation of some of the things that happened. But there's a lot more that led up to this point. So overall in Western Europe, they were just experiencing crisis after crisis for about 200 years straight, with barely any breathing room in between. So one group of crises, kind of going to the beginning of the 14th century, is these economic conditions or crises. So this is the next slide. There was famine at that time. There was a regular pattern of cold and wet growing seasons for much of the time period between 1300 to 1320. And it's estimated that in those years, in the first 20 years of the 14th century, somewhere between 10 to 20% of the population in Western Europe died because of food shortages and malnutrition. Then it's not too long after that you get the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, going from 1347 to 1351. That is said to kill off approximately a third of the population. There were periodic outbreaks that followed in the decades after that, and I think it was a plague that spread mostly through rats at the time, which is pretty common in those places. So really, then what happens? You have the 100 Years' War after that, that's England and France, and so that didn't affect the Reformation countries all that much, but it just contributed to this overall sense of unease in the continent. So between some of these wars, between the agricultural failures and plague, there's estimates that the population of Western Europe decreased by 60% or so over the course of 120 years. So a big crisis. One of the effects of this was then the relationship between the peasants and their landowners, because there's this widespread loss of population. The local lords would increase the time that their peasants would need to work, and that kind of violates their previous agreements of what they would work for. And so then there's also a series of peasant revolts that would come up over the years and in different places. And then usually what follows a peasant revolt is a brutal repression by the landowners and the lords. This also contributes to this growing sense of unease and just an unknown future. One of the other effects with that broken relationship or tense relationship is that the poor no longer have the sense that the church is necessarily their defender. And so what we get in the 14th and into the 15th century is a combination of bad weather, poor harvests, famine and starvation, disease, war. It starts to sound like the Revelation 6 description of the fourth horseman of the apocalypse. And so a lot of questions start to get asked. Another tectonic plate that's shifting, this is the next slide, is the growing loss of trust in the religious institutions in the Church of Rome. And this is mostly to do with the popes, the papal authorities, their authorities just being frittered away. A couple of big things happen in this period. So one is called the Avignon Papacy. And what this is begins in 1309 when the Catholic Church installs a Frenchman as the new pope, Pope Clement V. Now, this isn't uncommon that the pope is non-Italian. I don't think he's the first French pope. But what was different is that this man, Clement V, refused to make Rome his primary residence. So he set up shop in France, and they settled on this town of Avignon. And at first it seemed like they would kind of try to make this work and make a concession around this. But then a couple things began to happen that made the other leaders and cardinals in the Catholic Church begin to regret this decision and this concession. First of all, they started to see favoritism really showing forth. And so the Pope he was pretty clear that he was giving favoritism to the French king rather than being a bit more neutral. Also, they were starting to see a lot of moral compromise, and so the papal town of Avignon was apparently a cesspool for sexual immorality. Now, at the end of this, there's a new Pope, Gregory VII, and he agrees to move back to Rome. And so it seems like that has a nice little close on it, but there's a bit of damage done in the meantime. Now, it's only a couple months after Gregory VII moves back to Rome that he dies. So now they have to elect a new Pope. And so, there's some real zealous people that don't want to see something like this happen again, so they kind of campaign and kind of forcefully, get to the point where they elect an Italian Pope again, get, back on track. So they got what they wanted, but then there's a group of French cardinals that kind of aren't happy with it, and they say that this new Pope is not legitimate. So then they take one of their cardinals and they decide that he's going to be Pope. And so they elect him, and then they go back to Avignon with their Pope, Pope Urban, and now there are two popes. bit of a problem. So that's the loss of trust in the religious institution. Next slide is, the rising nationalism. One of the effects of having two popes is that now there's a lot of wheeling and dealing with the different nations, because the nations pay a pretty big premium, their ministry shares, to Rome. But now there are two popes, two towns claiming to be the head of the church. And so then there actually becomes some bargaining. And so, if you're caught between denominational offices and Grand Rapids is saying, well, you pay this amount, but Burlington starts giving you a lower number, and you can see where this gets a bit dicey. But overall, this starts to give a little more independence to the identity of some of these nations, especially when it comes to their religion. Another thing that starts to come up in all of this is a growing pride in people's own native tongue. So Latin is kind of the scholarly language, the religious language, but the kind of more, the heightening of the place of people's common native tongue begins to come up. And so that also leads to a bit more of an independent national identity happening. Next slide. Another area, another tectonic plate that's shifting is just general moral decline. This really kind of links with that loss of trust section. We know a lot about the abuses and sexual abuses of priests and clergy today. What makes it different in the Middle Ages is that it was not hidden, nor necessarily attempted to be hidden, and sometimes even bragged about. A couple examples, we have Pope Alexander VI. He kind of openly flaunted and bragged about his breach of celibacy as a priest. He had many children with many different women, and he would actually give his children important positions in the church, including naming one of his 9-year-old sons as a cardinal. So that's a pretty big mockery of the religious institution as well. Pope Leo X, and if you look at the dates, you recognize that he is the pope during the time of Martin Luther's big rise. It's written here that he declared at one point that God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it. And so these are just some examples that speak to the kind of leadership of the church that the people have become more and more accustomed to. And this has a number of effects. There's general loss of trust. But another effect is that it becomes really hard to recruit a new generation of priests and monastics who take their religion seriously when they look at the people that they would be under the authority of and they see, well, they're not really taking it seriously. So it's really hard to recruit a new good generation of priests and monastics. It also affects people's spiritual lives. Because how can you trust someone with the practice of confession and go into the confessional if you don't believe that they have any sense of sin or the enormity of their sin? Another one that comes up here, next slide, is the invention of the printing press. Now, this is not necessarily a tectonic shift or a crisis, but it's a significant invention. Around 1439 with Johannes Gutenberg, and this allows for the mass distribution of information material that played an essential role into the beginnings of the Reformation movement and how it was sustained. So next year, when you have a speaker who kind of talks about 1515 to 1530, they can go back to that. In general, it's also a period where there's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of innovation in medicine. People travel to the Far East. It's kind of a turning of the page of an age of math and physics. So one of the tectonic shifts here is there's also a sense that there's an old world that's passing away and a new world that's coming. Next slide is another area of shift is happening in theological issues. And some good and some bad are concerning. One of the things that's interesting, and I think a good thing, and that was reflective in the Reformation, is a retrieval of the older theological traditions. Some of this, and a retrieval of some key biblical studies skills. So there's a group that's beginning to be interested in classic literature, like the writings of the church fathers. So the name that you may hear with this is Erasmus from Rotterdam, and he kind of led a group called the Humanists. They're called humanists not because they're really interested in prioritizing the human nature, but they're interested in the humanities, old classic literature. Another thing that leads to the retrieval of some older theological tradition and biblical studies is the fall of Constantinople in the 1450s. And so that's kind of the main city of kind of the Eastern Church. It's modern-day Istanbul. So the Ottoman Empire kind of besieges that, and it leads to all of these more Eastern Orthodox scholars and people moving west and settling in Western Europe, and especially in Italy and around Rome. And one of the things they bring with them is their books and their literature. And the Roman Catholic Church had primarily been using Latin translations of the Bible, but then all of these Orthodox folks come and they have Greek manuscripts. And so then it just opens up this whole world of biblical studies to people who are professors and church scholars in the Catholic Church. And one of the ways you see this pop up in the early reformers, just a little side note, is that the early reformers really weren't focused on setting up new doctrine, but they were really trying to retrieve the older doctrines. I come up, I always see this whenever I'm trying to, if I trace something down or chase something down in something like Calvin's Institutes. And if you read Calvin's Institutes, and you look at all the footnotes in there, this is a bit of hyperbole, but it seems like 75% of the footnotes are either, referencing Psalms or Augustine. So there's a retrieval that's happening here. Some of the theological issues that go on the negative side that are developing is one that's often talked about is these indulgences. Now, indulgences don't just start right before the Reformation. The name that is often associated with that is Mr. Tetzel. But indulgences were something that were talked about, I think, for centuries before this, as just generally a way to reduce the amount of punishment that one would have to undergo for their sins. So indulgences was a practice in which someone could reduce the amount of punishment they would have for their sins. So it started with things requiring people or telling people to do things like, say, some specific prayers, go on a pilgrimage, go to a holy site like a church or some kind of shrine or cemetery, or they would be told to do some certain good works. So that's actually not really bad things in and of themselves. But over time, another practice was that you could give money. And the first instances that where people would give money as a source of indulgence, or to get an indulgence to reduce their punishment for their sins, was that this money was used to fund hospitals and charities. But then, as a lot of things go, things become commercialized. And by the time we get to the early 16th century, in the years of Martin Luther, the indulgences were being sold to raise money for capital projects like basilicas and cathedrals. So these are the main kind of background shifts that I just wanted to go through and lay before us all. And I think it's kind of interesting to examine some of these things because people often think, and I've often thought, that the Reformation happened because of just a big theological crisis. The church was just in a theological, wreck. But this gives us a picture of just the overall condition of the church, and not just the church, the overall condition of society, the overall condition of the Western world. And so then this is what leads to a tipping point. Now, if you add all of these things together, it leads to the kind of questions that people of that time would probably be asking. Like, is this divine judgment for all the failures of our world, or our society, or of the church? You can see how it kind of sets people up to be ready to grab a hold of a savior figure. And I think when we look at all of this, kind of from 2022, you can look at all these things, add them all up, and the question that I wonder about is, was the Reformation inevitable? Was it inevitable that it was going to happen? And thinking of that question, or looking at that question, how I think a lot of historians answer it is that they say that something like the Reformation was bound to happen. Something was going to give at this time. It didn't have to look exactly the way it did. And so the Reformation isn't just a Luther thing, though there's no doubt that the specific shape that the Reformation took has Luther's fingerprints, and his personality and his interests, all over it. His emphasis of justification by faith, his insistence that the church move away from the kind of hierarchy it had, the emphasis of how we read and interpret Scripture. And so it was inevitable. So now we're going to shift to part 2 of what I want to bring up today, and that's just to kind of examine some of the gains and losses. And I know this is a little disjointed because we just led up to the Reformation and we're just skipping the actual events itself, but I was given rope and this is where I went with it. Some of the gains. So next slide. Well, the big one is that it stopped this downward spiral of the state of the church. Not overnight, but the church is losing its credibility, it's losing its necessity, it's losing its message, and it's also losing kind of any living example that this message is good news for the world. And so that's a big gain. It just didn't allow the church to continue on into its complete demise. Another gain is that this doesn't happen overnight, but eventually it's the Protestant movement that really champions and moves forward with worldwide missions. Previously, the expansion of Christianity would happen through the expansion of the Catholic Church empire. But now you have missions. Now missions is more influenced by this doctrine of justification by faith, and faith alone. And so it eventually spurs on a whole mission movement of evangelism. Another thing that's really gained and retrieved with the Reformation is catechism, catechesis, especially of younger generations. Most people here are probably very familiar with the Heidelberg Catechism as kind of the historic expression in the Christian Reformed Church. And that's born out of the necessity to catechize, to instruct the younger generations who are now growing up in this Protestant world. And now we have to kind of teach them and disciple them in this new Protestant, expressed faith. Catechism was not invented by the Reformers. It wasn't invented by the people who put together the Heidelberg Catechism. Catechism has been around for a long time, and it's really just, generally, the way that the church taught the Christian faith and life. And so there's the Catholic Catechism, and then Luther had a catechism, and Calvin had a catechism, and then there's the Heidelberg Catechism, and there's been other ones. Generally speaking, the catechism is built around the 3 rules of faith. So the Apostles' Creed, and what are the other 2 that the catechism goes through? 10 Commandments, Lord's Prayer. So if you actually look up the Luther Catechism and Calvin's Genevan Catechism and the Catholic Catechism, they'll actually all just walk through the same things, but with different theological emphasis and conviction. And so the Reformation really sparked a resurgence in this. Another big gain I think we get from the Reformation is putting the Bible in people's hands. It was something that existed in Latin, and Luther translated it into German. And when he translated into German, he did it from the Greek New Testament. And I don't know what he would have done for the Old Testament I don't know if he had access to Hebrew, if he knew Hebrew, or anyone that knew Hebrew. But this puts the Bible in people's hands. And that has 2 effects. One is on the scholarly side, since he goes back to the Greek in his translation, it starts a resurgence in biblical scholarship to go back to the source material. So that's key. And then for the laity, it just leads to people being able to read and engage with the Bible on their own. It also then increases literacy, has effects on education and all of that. And so putting the Bible in people's hands is a massive gain and effect of the Reformation. And then there's the theological side of recovering good theological doctrines, like justification by faith, the authority of Scripture, and the way God is present in the Lord's Supper. And then the last one I put up here that I remember a professor of mine saying was how the Reformation led to a whole resurgence in hymns and hymn singing in churches. And you just think of people like Charles Wesley and Isaac Watts. And it's the hymns that are really the ways of getting pretty deep theology just into the bones of people. And so that's a big gain from the Reformation. So what about some of the losses? So that's the next slide. Some of the losses. One that I think we can see, and these don't all happen overnight, but just a general loss in the authority of the church. Now, to be fair, this was happening before 1517. But there's just a slow kind of step. By what I mean by authority of the church is this kind of other part where I wrote on there of tradition of the church. Yes, it's great that we have authority of Scripture, but then it's easy to break off Scripture from the tradition in which it's been interpreted. And that can lead to a lot of individualization. So it's great that individuals can read the Bible for their own, but then it also begins to put interpretation often in the hands of individuals. And so individuals sometimes read the Bible without necessarily some accountability or responsibility for what they believe it to mean. So that's one of the losses that people talk about with the Reformation. I think related to this whole idea of authority is kind of it comes back to some of the nationalism side of things, where what happens in the next number of decades in the Reformation is that all these countries in Western Europe, or a lot of countries in Western Europe, kind of have their own new national Protestant church. So the Germans have the Lutheran Church, and the Dutch have their Reformed Church, and the English have the Anglican Church, and the Scottish have the Presbyterian Church, and so then so it actually leads to a new form of church and state, which doesn't really exist now like it did then, but that had some ill effects over the years as well. Another one that's easy to talk about and that's often referenced is just what this does to the unity of the church with the Reformation. And it's a massive one. Now, I'm tentative to say that this broken communion of the church is a loss in the Reformation, because once again, it seemed like the unity of the church was already broken leading into it. And another reason I'd be tentative to say that it's a loss or the fault of the Reformation is that Luther and his followers, they weren't actually trying to start a new church. They wanted to reform the church that existed, but they got kicked out. So there's that. But it is still a loss because it's been 500 years. And it seems like that gulf that was open back then is, it's not getting filled in too easily. So there's a real loss of the unity of the church that still exists. Another one that this comes up in just some of the things I was reading and reviewing, and admittedly I don't quite have a handle on this last point as much, but people talk about with the Reformation, there's a loss of the sacramental view of the world that the Catholic Church really had, and that the early reformers didn't take with them in as much as they could have. And so you see this kind of slow drift away from this sacramental view of the world, how God is present in creation and present before us. You can see it in the way people understood the Lord's Supper and this shift from the idea that he is present in the bread and wine, and then Luther moves to saying, well, he is present kind of beside the bread and the wine, and Calvin say he's present by faith in the Holy Spirit, and then it kind of goes on to the point where now the Lord's Supper is just a memorial, just a way to remember. And so that's literally a loss of sacramental view of things. I think this can also point to the way that the church began to think of things like images and murals, stained glass windows and stories, and art in general became less and less significant in the decades and centuries following the Reformation, and rather than as ways to kind of just engage the biblical story more, it became seen as superstitious or idolatrous. And so another way I think you can see this loss of the sacramental view of the world is that the reformers started putting, they did well in saying it's important to have proper belief, but we become so focused on the holiness of God and how we are made holy before God through Christ that we just generally lose the sense that we're standing on holy ground now. And so there's some losses here. And these gains and losses, obviously not an exhaustive list, and maybe during some discussion time, there's maybe some other ones that you have in mind that'd be great to hear about. So, kind of in summary of this part, the Reformation, it is a seismic event that changes the world. It hasn't been the same. It's not the first of such events. It's not the last. And so, as the title for this talk was given, should we celebrate it or should we grieve it? My humble suggestion is to consider the Reformation like we do a lot of major innovations these days, like cars, the internet, smartphones, which is that it is significant but flawed. A significant but flawed product. So now the last part that I wanted to just go over a little bit and offer some reflections on is the lessons that I think hopefully we can take from this, or maybe just a few ideas. Because if we are going to grieve it, well then let's do it as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4, that we are people who grieve, who do not grieve without hope. So, where might there be some hope or some opportunity? We're there. One is to stop stereotyping the Roman Catholic Church today as if it was the Roman Catholic Church of the 16th and 15th and 14th century. And so, the Roman Catholic Church today is not your enemy. Maybe we need to all say that one together. I remember being asked once, I was in Prince George for 9 years, and I remember being at a gathering at one of the families from our church. There's a number of couples there. And I have no idea the context of this question, but someone asked me, hey, if you were to move to another denomination for whatever reason, where do you think, where would your next landing spot be? And I just kind of blurted out, maybe the Catholic Church. And people, ooh. And then, why? And so I just said, and it's kind of, it's funny now thinking back on it. I said, I said, interestingly enough, this isn't why I would go, but I said, interestingly enough, that the two reasons why I could go is that, at the time I was single, and I'm a man. So there you go, so I could do it. The irony being that I think it's not very good to require all your pastors to be single, and I do affirm the role of women in all offices of ministry. So interesting that the two things that would qualify me are the two things that would actually prevent me from going to the Catholic Church. But just in general, there has been a lot of reform in the Catholic Church over 500 years. And I don't know if Martin Luther, if he was here today, would be a perfectly content and happy person in the Catholic Church today, but I don't think it'd be too far of a stretch to say that. Another important thing that I think we can take from the Reformation and just considering its gains and losses is the importance of ecumenism, the ecumenical movement. And so kind of doing things that build church unity together. Actually, just praying together. Having worship services with other churches. I think it's a beautiful thing. I don't want all of my anecdotes on this just to refer back to my time in Prince George. But what's interesting about Prince George is that it's just the right size of city where you can have one of every franchise. So every kind of franchise restaurant, there'll be one of them in Prince George. And the same thing is for churches. So if you're looking at it as a denomination, decades ago, and you're thinking, where do we need to plant a church? And Prince George will be able to sustain it. And so, there's one CRC, there's one Canadian Reformed Church, there's one of this Lutheran church, one of that Lutheran church, maybe 2 Baptist churches. And so that's kind of interesting. But what it meant is that if you wanted collegiality, you came to the monthly ministerial, where we prayed together and we sang together. And that was something that I grew a high value for in my time there. And I think it's something that, and that's not something that just pastors need, but our churches need some good kinds of ecumenical gatherings. It's also important, I think, today just to be reminded that we're part of something so much bigger. So that's something maybe we need to keep an eye out for and try to create. Another kind of lesson I think we can take from this is there's the gain of catechesis. But this relates to the first point, how our enemy isn't the Roman Catholic Church. And so our catechesis needs to be counter catechesis. Now, so what does that mean? Well, it's interesting that if, say you look at the creeds and confessions of our church, none of them are ever written because a group of people said, we're bored, let's come up with a big document that we can argue over and, then all sign off on. But they all happen out of some kind of crisis. So, the Nicene Creed with Arianism, and the Apostles' Creed, with Gnosticism and kind of defending the Trinity. And so, Nicene Creed really spells out the dual nature of Jesus, because that was, at stake at that time. Because if you lose the dual nature of Christ, you lose, the theology of the atonement. And then you have the Athanasian Creed, which basically does the same thing, just on steroids. And then you have the Heidelberg Catechism, which is born out of the need to catechize another generation. The Belgic Confession is just, we need to summarize what this whole new Protestant faith actually is. So that's kind of your more like mini paragraphs and essays. And so there's always a crisis. With Our World Belongs to God, a contemporary testimony. I think that starts to get at a counter catechesis, in that it's trying to counter some of the cultural narratives that are just generally believed hook, line, and sinker by people. You get that at the end of Our World Belongs to God. And so, if our biggest threat to our faith is not Catholicism, then I think we need ways to catechize everyone in the church, and especially our youth, to offer a Christian alternative to the commonly believed secular narratives of our time about identity, freedom, happiness, the creed of, if it feels good, do it, or, morality, and that, everyone should be able to choose what is right and wrong for themselves. So this is, I think, a big project that I hope someone else is working on, that I can just adopt. Another one that I wonder about is if we need to recover a sense of what unity means. And that's not just unity for the sake of unity, or cheap unity, which just allows for the plurality of beliefs, because that's diversity and plurality, not necessarily unity. And so it's, trying to figure out how we take differences seriously and which ones should we take seriously. We need to think deeply about when the pursuit of unity might have come at the cost of truth. And then also to consider, what differences on truth or doctrine can still actually exist. And we can still be the Holy Catholic Church, lowercase c Catholic. Another thing I think to consider with the Reformation and going forward is the necessity to strengthen our churches. And I know that, you can say that, every year and in every moment. But if you consider the list that we came up with of these tectonic shifts the general sense of unease that existed in the Western world, man, they actually look very familiar to today in a lot of ways. Rising nationalism, wars, ecological crisis, a loss of the middle class. Not just a loss in religious institutions, but all institutions. And we've had another major shift in communication technology. And so people need a healthy landing place, a hospital, as they really come face to face with big questions of life. And when the things that they thought were strong and they thought they believed in, when they crumble beneath them, they need a place that can offer them timeless answers. I think one of the ways I saw this with COVID early on is really interesting to see that within a couple weeks of the world locking down, Alpha exploded. People familiar with Alpha a little bit? It's one of the big evangelistic tools or programs, and you invite people in, there's a video, you eat a meal, there's discussion. And it's really great at introducing people to the Christian faith in a real honest and deep way. And so then churches started doing this online. And the churches that were already good at it, that were already using it and, evangelistic in nature, they just exploded with people signing up, because all of a sudden they're faced with questions about the meaning of life and security and death that they just really hadn't had to face. And so it's important, I think there's always an opportunity for the church to strive to be a strong, healthy church, so that when times of crisis come, people have a place that is a non-anxious presence in the world and very stable. The last thing that I wrote up here is that we always need to keep our eye focused on the truly Reformed church, which is not here yet. It is to come when the head of the church returns. And there's a union between heaven and earth, and all is made new, and we all live in the glory of God. And so it's to remember that the vision of what the church is to be is not necessarily measured as trying to be better than our past, but it's always trying to strive for what the future is. The church is eschatological in that way. We look at what our hope is for the future and what it's going to be, and we live out of that hope in the present. So that's my talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pastor, for a lot of preparation time, I'm sure, because that was a talk with a lot of depth to it. So we really appreciate you taking the time out of your already busy schedule to assist us in this way. We do have a few minutes for some questions. If anybody has a question that they'd like to offer, and we could take a question or two. So please put up your hand and I'll take you the mic, because we are being live streamed, and so people would like to hear the questions as well.
Thank you. Pastor Andrew, you mentioned just briefly also intellectual thought, the thinking, the universities and stuff like that, and the thinking. I'm just wondering if you can reflect on this idea of nature and grace. There's a bit of a dichotomy that you have natural theology, and that structure in the Reformation seems to have kind of been changed, at least for reformers, into something, of sin and grace as being the ultimate dichotomy. Can you say something about that and some of the effect that might have had?
very limited in what I can offer. Yeah, I think because I think historically this goes back to people like Thomas Aquinas, who recovers the philosophy of Aristotle, and so there's that connection. And so probably the only thing that I can offer is to say that I've seen the shift. I understand where it goes. As in terms of all the effects, I don't really have much to offer. Do you? Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Any further questions?
I'm quite intrigued with the de-sacramentalization, if you like, of understanding the natural order of things. And I've read a variety of books about that as well. One of the things that I've recently sort of read about is that desacramentalization also set the stage for the natural order being conceived of as being dead, that it is only acted upon, that it does not have its own agency. So we read about the selfish gene, which is kind of an internal contradiction by Dawkins, and that the genes really, Dawkins says, have no agency, but when he puts the word selfish in front of it, it seems like those genes are up to something, and that they're going to do something on their own. But in the Catholic view, well, maybe still, that notion of things have some intent on their own, you know, like an embryo has an intention of becoming a mature adult, and that's built into the embryo. But also, even one can think of then, well, maybe these atoms or, you know, molecules, and I was just listening to something today that these, I gotta think, I've got to reconstruct what that was earlier in the day, that this thing has some intention. It was a molecule, an enzyme really, an enzyme that could deconstruct this hard plastic, these long polymers, and it comes from the saliva of some kind of I can't remember, some kind of a thing. It was on the podcast from The Guardian, Science Weekly, but the talk then of the people who were talking about that is that enzyme has some intention, you know, some agency, if you like, of demolishing these long polymers, and that might be a good thing for our world because these polymers are all over the place. And but that whole business of thinking about nature as something that is only acted upon rather than itself having its own agency. So I just wonder if you have any further comments on that desacramentalization process and what the world was like for the Catholic establishment prior to the Reformation.
Once again, I probably can't offer anything substantive, but there's definitely a connection between those, you know, those two questions there. I don't know if I can offer much to you on that. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I have a number of questions, and I'll try to stick to just a little bit. I mean, looking at the Reformation from, 2022, I'm more disappointed with what the results have been of that. And one is the fragmentation of the Christian message, because we have so many Protestant denominations, each of which claim to have the truth. And although which is not a good thing, And I liked your emphasis on the search for unity, but I don't see in our own church, our own denomination, much effort toward a search for unity with other churches. Another thing is that what divides the churches seems to be a matter of creeds and confessions, things that you can write on paper, not how to live your life in the service of Christ, you know. So I'm not sure whether we put too much emphasis on theology. That theology divides more than it unifies. I'll leave it at that.
So I think on that one, all valid critiques and comments. I think the theological differences between church denominations was probably more of an emphasis, you know, from 1500 to 1800 or 1900. I think especially in the last 150 years or so, I'm not fully convinced that all of the differences in the churches are as theological as we think. There's a little book written by Richard Niebuhr, so Reinhold Niebuhr's lesser-known brother, and this is in like the 1920s, and he's a sociologist, and so he wrote a sociological analysis of denominations in North America. I think the CRC gets a little mention on one page in it. And he makes the case that, nowadays, 1920 and then, that observing this, that most of the differences between denominations are more sociological than theological. We're not as theological as we think in our differences. And so, you see this with, a lot of immigration, like in North America, immigration in North America. And so, what do? You set up the church that you had in your homeland rather than look for the opportunity to join one that's actually pretty similar to, what you believe. And I think that's actually where the CRC gets mentioned in this book, naming a couple other churches that it could have very easily joined up with. But yeah, your point about being united on what the Christian life and witness looks like is a great place to try to have unity and emphasize that. Because when it comes, you can say all these different beliefs, but at the end of the day, if you compare, your own life to that of the person in the Pentecostal church down the street and your coworker who might go to the Catholic Church, they actually look probably very similar. Hopefully.
Any further questions? I have one, Pastor, and that is, and it's not my idea, but somehow, and I can't really give credit to anyone because I don't remember where I heard it or read it, and that is that the general disunification that was the result of the Reformation, giving rise to things like the 30 Years' War, which killed off about 40% of the population in Europe, in certain parts of Europe anyway, just gave rise to a disgust with religion and it providing any way forward in terms of truth and unity for society, so that people abandoned religion altogether and went to a different source. And those were generally classic sources, rationalism, the various kinds of Greek philosophies, which are part of the Enlightenment. And so essentially the secularization of secular humanism is a direct result of the disunity that was fostered by the Reformation. So a kind of an ironic twist where the Reformation tended to, or wanted to reform. It in fact was the sort of the seeds of the death of religion as a formative societal force.
Well, you're right on there, I think, and I had a line in the losses about, it's kind of a stepping stone to this individualization, and so thanks for elaborating on that, because we live in a secular age, and the person that's kind of captured that the best in scholarship is a Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor. And if you look at his book called Secular Age, he spends a considerable amount of time on the Reformation as one of the, if not maybe the biggest, catalyst that caused us to move, which, in the secular, when you talk about secular age, we're talking about the shift from a time where 500 years ago, at the start, around 1517, we lived in a time where it was almost inconceivable to not believe in God. And now we live in a time where it is almost inconceivable to say you do believe in God. And the Reformation was perhaps one of the biggest, if not the biggest, catalyst to that movement. Now, I guess the next question that would raise, so you can put this on your list of talks, not me, is the move to a secular age inevitable? But for whatever, all the different reasons was, the Reformation, big part.
Last chance for a question. Anyone? Oh.
I'm not sure if I can quite formulate it yet, but would you say that Vatican II was probably the Roman Catholic Church's own Reformation, and that since that has contributed to the rise of ecumenism?
Big time. Yeah, and and that's where I think it was a number of people. There's a number of people who would say that after Vatican II, Luther would probably be content with the state of the Catholic Church. Yeah.
Well, we are coming to the time when we usually go home, and so I just want to thank you once again, Pastor. Could you join me in a gesture of thanks to the Pastor? And also thanks to Inglewood Christian Reformed Church for hosting this event tonight. Thank you to our technical crew, which is comprised of the one and only Theo Hemmelkamp, who has pretty much engaged the whole system back there. Thank you very much, Theo. Our next session, our next family chat, will be on Tuesday evening, November 1. That's 2 weeks from tonight. It's at 7 o'clock, same time. But it will be at West End Christian Reformed Church. I think probably everyone here knows where that is. The presenters will be Frank Van Veen and Jim Visser, who happens to be with us tonight. And they are 2 Christian artists, and they'll be speaking on Brushstrokes, Christian Artists' Reflection. It's at West End Christian Reformed Church, 7 o'clock, Tuesday, November the 1st. So please join us if you can, or on live stream. And with that, I just want to bid you all good night. Thank you so much for your attendance. Thank you for coming in by live stream, those of you who did. And thanks once again, Pastor. Good night.
Yeah, so you would know